The neighbors thought he was just a broken old man who'd lost his mind in the mines. They had no idea that every night for 40 years, he'd been adding to a collection that would shock the world and answer questions that had haunted the town since 1881. Thomas McKenna had once been the most respected mining foreman in Copper Creek, Colorado. A man whose word was law underground, whose expertise had saved countless lives, and whose booming laughter could be heard echoing through the mountain valleys every evening after work. Children would run to greet him as he walked home, their faces lighting up when he'd pull wrapped candy from his pockets. Wives would wave from their kitchen windows, knowing their husbands were safe under Thomas's watchful eye. The local saloon keeper would have Thomas's favorite whiskey ready before he even pushed through the swinging doors, and the Presbyterian minister would always save him a seat in the third pew for Sunday service. But that was before the morning of September 15, 1923. Before the cave-in that would haunt Thomas McKenna for the rest of his days and transform him from the town's most beloved citizen into its most mysterious hermit. The day had started like any other. Thomas arrived at the Copper Creek mine at 5 in the morning, his metal lunch pail clanking against his leg as he walked through the pre-dawn darkness. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke from the town's chimneys, and frost sparkled on the wooden mine structures like diamonds. 18 men reported for duty that morning, good men with families to feed and dreams to chase. Thomas knew each of their names, knew their wives and children, knew which ones sent money to relatives back east and which ones were saving to buy their own land. The first sign of trouble came at 10:30, when Thomas noticed an unusual creaking in the support timbers near Shaft 7. His experienced ear caught the subtle stress patterns that younger miners might miss, the way the wood whispered warnings to those who knew how to listen. He immediately ordered the area evacuated, but as the men began filing toward the exit, a secondary tunnel system that hadn't been properly mapped gave way. The sound was like thunder trapped underground, a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. In 3 terrifying seconds, 17 men were buried under tons of rock and timber. Thomas, who had been bringing up the rear to ensure everyone escaped safely, found himself trapped in a small pocket of air, surrounded by the crushing weight of the collapsed mine shaft. For 43 hours, Thomas remained buried alive, listening to the desperate sounds of the rescue operation above him. He could hear his name being called, could hear the frantic voices of wives and children who had gathered at the mine entrance, could hear the steam-powered equipment working around the clock to move the massive boulders that entombed him. But what haunted him most during those endless hours of darkness was the silence from the 17 men who hadn't made it out. When the rescue team finally reached Thomas, they found him clutching something in his dirt-caked hands. It was a small leather pouch, partially buried in the debris, containing what appeared to be old gold coins and a fragment of yellowed paper with writing that was barely legible. Thomas was so traumatized by his ordeal that he couldn't speak coherently for weeks, and in the chaos of treating his injuries and dealing with the tragedy of the 17 deaths, nobody paid much attention to the artifacts he'd found in the collapsed shaft. The mining company's investigation was swift and decisive. Structural failure due to unexpected geological conditions, they concluded. An act of God that couldn't have been prevented or predicted. The families of the deceased miners received modest compensation. Thomas was given a pension for his injuries and trauma, and within 6 months, operations at Copper Creek Mine resumed in different sections of the mountain. But Thomas couldn't resume his life so easily. The guilt of being the sole survivor ate at him like acid. He'd lie awake at night, hearing the voices of his lost crew members, wondering why fate had chosen to spare him while taking 17 better men. The laughter that had once filled the saloon fell silent. The children who had run to greet him now scattered when they saw him coming, frightened by the hollow look in his eyes and the way he'd stare off into the distance as if seeing ghosts. It was during this period of grief and isolation that Thomas began to study the artifacts he'd found in the collapsed mine shaft. The leather pouch contained 12 gold coins, each dated 1881, and the paper fragment bore part of what appeared to be an official document from the Denver Merchants Bank. As Thomas carefully cleaned and examined these items night after night in his lonely cabin, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The coins were part of a larger collection, their serial numbers sequential in a way that suggested they'd come from a single, large transaction. The paper fragment contained partial words that, when combined with Thomas's knowledge of local history, pointed to something that had been whispered about in Copper Creek for over 40 years. The disappearance of a $50,000 payroll shipment that had vanished without a trace in 1881. Thomas began researching the old newspaper archives, spending entire days in the basement of the town library, poring over yellowed headlines and faded photographs. The story that emerged was more complex and sinister than the simple bandit robbery that had been reported at the time. On November 3, 1881, a stagecoach carrying the monthly payroll for the Copper Creek Mining Company had left Denver with $50,000 in gold coins, enough money to pay 300 miners for 2 months of dangerous underground work. The coach was scheduled to arrive in Copper Creek on November 5th, but it never reached its destination. The official report claimed that bandits had ambushed the stagecoach at Devil's Canyon, killed the driver and guards, and made off with the entire payroll. But Thomas's research revealed troubling inconsistencies in this story. The route the stagecoach had taken was not the standard Denver to Copper Creek road. Instead, it had followed a longer, more treacherous path through mountain passes that were known only to company insiders. The bodies of the driver and guards were never found, despite extensive searches by both local authorities and federal marshals. Most suspicious of all, the robbery had occurred during a period when no bandit activity had been reported anywhere in the territory. As Thomas dug deeper into the historical records, he discovered that 3 of the mining company's senior executives had left Colorado shortly after the robbery, claiming they were pursuing business opportunities in California. These men had never returned to Copper Creek, and their sudden departure had been explained as coincidental by the company's board of directors. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: the geological survey maps that Thomas had studied as part of his mining education. The area where the stagecoach had allegedly been robbed was directly above the section of the mine that had collapsed, burying Thomas and his crew. The mathematical precision was too perfect to be coincidental. Thomas realized with growing horror that the payroll had never been stolen by bandits. It had been hidden by corrupt company officials who had planned to retrieve it later, after the investigation died down and suspicion moved elsewhere. The stagecoach robbery had been staged. The driver and guards had likely been murdered to eliminate witnesses, and the gold had been concealed in a specially constructed chamber within the mine itself. But the corrupt officials had underestimated the complexity of the underground geological formations. Over the decades, natural shifts in the rock structure had sealed off the hidden chamber, making it inaccessible through the original entrance. It had taken a catastrophic cave-in, one that cost 17 innocent lives, to accidentally reveal the location where the stolen payroll had been hidden for 42 years. Thomas faced a terrible dilemma. The evidence he'd uncovered implicated some of the most powerful families in Colorado, including men who were still alive and influential in 1923. The mining company that had employed him for 20 years was built on a foundation of theft and murder. The accident that had killed his crew hadn't been an act of God. It had been the indirect result of criminal activities that had gone unpunished for over 4 decades. But Thomas also understood that going public with his discoveries would put his own life in danger. The men who had orchestrated the 1881 robbery were still powerful enough to destroy anyone who threatened to expose their crimes. They had killed to protect their secret once before, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again. So Thomas made the most difficult decision of his life. He would disappear from civilization, but he wouldn't abandon his responsibility to the truth. He sold his house in town, quit his job at the mine, and used his savings to purchase a remote cabin 15 miles up the mountain, accessible only by a treacherous dirt road that became impassable during the harsh Colorado winters. To the townspeople of Copper Creek, Thomas McKenna had simply given up on life. They watched with pity as the once gregarious foreman transformed into a reclusive hermit who spoke to no one and trusted no one. Some blamed his behavior on survivor's guilt. Others thought he'd been driven insane by his traumatic experience in the collapsed mine. A few compassionate souls made the difficult journey to his mountain cabin during the first few years, hoping to convince him to return to civilization. But Thomas made it clear that visitors were not welcome. What nobody understood, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that Thomas hadn't retreated into isolation out of simple grief or madness. He had embarked on the most important mission of his life, documenting and preserving the evidence that would eventually bring justice to the families who had been robbed and murdered in 1881. Every night for 40 years, by the flickering light of kerosene lamps, Thomas worked on his investigation. He photographed every gold coin from multiple angles, documenting their dates, serial numbers, and mint marks. He carefully transcribed the partial text from the paper fragment, cross-referencing it with historical bank records that he obtained through painstaking correspondence with archives across the Western Territories. Thomas constructed detailed maps of the mine system as it had existed in 1881, using his professional knowledge of underground engineering to identify exactly where the hidden chamber had been located and how the corrupt officials had planned to access it. He traced the family histories of the three executives who had left Colorado after the robbery, discovering that their descendants had built impressive fortunes that couldn't be explained by their legitimate business activities. The isolation was brutal. Thomas spoke to no human being for months at a time, sustaining himself on canned goods and the vegetables he grew in a small garden behind his cabin. During the long winter months, when the mountain was cut off from civilization by impassable snow, he would sit by his fireplace and read aloud to himself from the evidence files he was compiling, as if rehearsing for the day when he would finally present his case to the world. The loneliness nearly drove him mad on several occasions. He would find himself talking to the photographs of his dead crew members, apologizing for surviving when they had perished, promising them that their deaths would not be meaningless if he could use his discovery to expose the corruption that had indirectly caused the mine collapse. Thomas aged rapidly in his mountain exile. His hair turned white, his back became bent from hunching over documents and photographs, and his hands developed arthritis from the precise work of cataloging evidence. But his mind remained sharp, focused on the single purpose that had sustained him through 4 decades of solitude. As the years passed, Thomas began to lose track of time and current events. He didn't know that many of the men he was protecting himself from had died of old age. He wasn't aware that the political and economic landscape of Colorado had changed dramatically, that the power structures he feared were no longer as formidable as they had been in the 1920s and 1930s. In his isolated mountain cabin, surrounded by the evidence of historical crimes, Thomas lived in a permanent state of 1923, when the danger had been real and immediate. The irony was profound. Thomas McKenna, who had spent 40 years preparing to expose a conspiracy, had become so removed from the world that he no longer understood when it might be safe to reveal his discoveries. He had transformed himself into a living ghost, a man who existed between past and present, haunted by crimes that had occurred before he was born and sustained by a mission that consumed his entire life. When Thomas died peacefully in his sleep on a cold February morning in 1963, at the age of 78, he left behind the most comprehensive criminal investigation ever conducted by a single individual. His body was discovered 3 days later by a park ranger who had noticed that smoke had stopped rising from the cabin's chimney. Sheriff David Martinez, a young lawman who had only recently been elected to serve the expanded county that now included the remote mountain areas, made the standard visit to secure the property of the deceased hermit. Martinez had heard stories about the crazy old miner who lived alone on the mountain, but he'd assumed they were exaggerated tales told by locals who enjoyed spinning yarns about eccentric characters. What Sheriff Martinez expected to find was the typical debris of a hermit's life: stacks of old newspapers, empty food cans, broken furniture, and the accumulated junk of a man who had lost touch with reality and society. Instead, when he pushed open the heavy wooden door of Thomas McKenna's cabin, Martinez found himself staring at the most meticulously organized archive he had ever seen. Every wall was lined with handmade filing cabinets, each drawer labeled with precise dates and categories written in Thomas's careful handwriting. The main room contained dozens of carefully preserved artifacts arranged with museum-quality attention to detail: gold coins in protective cases, vintage mining equipment, and hundreds of photographs of historical documents. Maps covered every inch of the walls, showing mine shafts, geological formations, and transportation routes marked with different colored inks to indicate various time periods and theories. But it was the final room that took Martinez's breath away and made him realize he was looking at something far more significant than the possessions of an eccentric hermit. Thomas had constructed a three-dimensional model of the entire Copper Creek mining operation as it had existed in 1881, complete with miniature buildings, working mine car tracks, and topographical features carved from wood and painted with extraordinary attention to detail. The model included the hidden chamber where the payroll had been concealed, marked with tiny red flags and connected by cotton string to locations where Thomas believed the conspirators had planned to eventually retrieve their stolen fortune. Cross-references in Thomas's handwriting connected each element of the model to corresponding files in his documentation system. Sheriff Martinez spent 3 hours in the cabin before he fully understood what he was looking at. This wasn't the collection of a madman. It was the life's work of a brilliant investigator who had solved one of the most famous unsolved crimes in Colorado history. The discovery made national news within a week. Historians from universities across the country traveled to the remote mountain cabin to examine Thomas's research. FBI agents arrived to investigate the criminal allegations that his evidence supported. Newspaper reporters filed stories that reached readers from coast to coast, telling the incredible tale of the hermit miner who had spent 40 years of his life ensuring that a 40-year-old injustice would finally be exposed. The gold coins, worth more than $2 million in 1963 currency, were authenticated by federal treasury experts and officially recognized as part of the original 1881 payroll shipment. Thomas's documentation was so comprehensive and professionally presented that it served as the foundation for criminal proceedings that were launched against the estates of the deceased conspirators and civil lawsuits filed on behalf of the families who had been cheated out of their wages more than 8 decades earlier. The families of the men who had been wrongfully accused of the 1881 stagecoach robbery were finally vindicated, their ancestors' names cleared of charges that had haunted their descendants for generations. The powerful families whose fortunes had been built on stolen gold faced legal challenges that would reshape the economic and political landscape of the entire region. More importantly, the mystery of the 1923 mine collapse was finally understood in its full context. The 17 men who had died hadn't been victims of a random geological accident. They had died as an indirect consequence of crimes committed 4 decades earlier. Thomas's investigation revealed that the structural instability that caused the cave-in had been caused by the unauthorized excavation work performed by the conspirators when they created their hidden chamber in 1881. But perhaps the most poignant discovery was Thomas McKenna's personal journal, found on his bedside table, open to the final entry he had written the night before he died. In his careful, precise handwriting, Thomas had recorded his thoughts on completing the mission that had consumed his entire adult life. February 10, 1963. Today marks the 40th anniversary of the day I crawled out of that collapsed mine shaft, the sole survivor of a tragedy that took 17 better men than myself. For 40 years, I have carried the burden of their deaths and the responsibility of the truth I discovered in that dark hole in the ground. I kept my promise to the 17 men who died in that mine. Their deaths were not in vain if the truth finally comes to light. I pray that my years of solitude have served a purpose greater than my own guilt and fear. I have documented everything, preserved every piece of evidence, and prepared a case that will speak for itself long after I am gone. I do not expect gratitude or recognition for what I have done. I chose this path not for glory, but for justice. The families who were robbed in 1881 deserve to know the truth. The men who were wrongfully accused deserve to have their names cleared. The 17 miners who died in 1923 deserve to have their deaths properly understood and honored. I have lived alone on this mountain for most of my adult life, but I have never felt alone in my mission. Every night, as I worked on this investigation, I could feel the presence of those 17 men guiding my research and encouraging me to persist when the loneliness became almost unbearable. Tomorrow, if God grants me another day, I will begin organizing the final presentation of my evidence. But if my time has come, I am confident that whoever discovers this collection will understand its importance and ensure that justice is finally served. I am ready to join my crew members, knowing that I have fulfilled my obligation to them and to the truth. The cabin where Thomas McKenna spent 40 years of his life now stands as a museum, preserved exactly as he left it, maintained by the Colorado Historical Society as a testament to one man's extraordinary dedication to justice. Visitors come from around the world to see the collection that a hermit miner spent 4 decades assembling, one piece at a time, in the lonely silence of the Colorado mountains. School children learn about Thomas McKenna as an example of how a single individual's commitment to truth can triumph over corruption and injustice, even when that commitment requires tremendous personal sacrifice. University students study his research methods as a masterclass in historical investigation and criminal forensics. Law enforcement agencies use his case as an example of how patience, persistence, and attention to detail can solve even the most complex and long-standing mysteries. But perhaps the most important lesson of Thomas McKenna's story is that heroism doesn't always look the way we expect it to look. Heroes don't always wear uniforms or seek recognition or receive parades in their honor. Sometimes they spend 40 years alone on a mountain, carefully preserving evidence and documenting truth, waiting for the day when justice can finally be served. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden not in the ground, but in the hearts of men who choose to do what's right, even when the cost is everything they hold dear. Thomas McKenna's legacy reminds us that one person's dedication to truth and justice can change the world, even if that person never lives to see the impact of their sacrifice. The hermit of Copper Creek Mountain became a legend not because he withdrew from society, but because he used his isolation to serve society in a way that no one else could have accomplished. His 40 years of solitude weren't an escape from responsibility. They were the ultimate expression of responsibility, carried out with a dedication that few people could sustain and a vision that spanned nearly half a century. If you're enjoying these incredible true stories of hidden secrets and unexpected discoveries, hit that subscribe button because we've got many more tales of mystery and revelation waiting for you. Click on the video on your screen to hear another story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the people living quietly in your own community, the secrets they might be keeping, and the extraordinary lengths some individuals will go to ensure that truth and justice ultimately prevail.